My name is Christina McClellan, and I'm a woman at Iowa.
I'm the Chief Curator at the University of Iowa
Marin,
Museum of Art, and I'm a woman at Iowa.
Gigi Durham. I'm an Associate Professor in the School of Journalism, and I'm a woman at Iowa.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Women at Iowa, a program produced by UITV and the Council on the Status of Women that captures the history, work, and experience of women on the University of Iowa campus. I'm Diana Harris, a staff member in the College of Engineering, and my guests today are the principal co-authors of the 2004 Sexual Harassment Survey that was done on the University of Iowa campus. Nancy Hauserman is the Williams Teaching Professor and Professor in the Tippie College of Business, and Leanna Clark is a professor and collegiate fellow in psychology in College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Welcome, and thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
So this is the survey and its follow-up report. The survey isn't nearly so long. I want to try to discuss a lot about what is in there and what your involvement was and what we found out and what's happened since then. So can you give me some background about why you got involved in writing the survey and producing the report that came after that?
Sure. I think for me, it was that sexual harassment for a number of years had been my primary area of research. I had been involved in the Jean Ju case, where I headed the faculty panel that looked at that case for the university, and I had helped the university to write an earlier sexual harassment policy and the consensual relations policy, and I had served for 3 years as university ombudsperson, so I had in fact dealt with some of the cases of sexual harassment on campus.
In my case, it was really a matter of timing. I happened to be the associate provost for faculty at the time, and that position carries with it is it de facto role of the liaison to the Council on the Status of Women. So when the Council on the Status of Women decided that they wanted to do this survey and have broad representation into developing the survey, I was the logical choice from the administration, from the provost's office. And then as things evolved, lots of people were involved, and then fewer people were involved, and then very few people were involved, and then Nancy and I ended up finalizing the report.
And what happened that the council came to you and said, we need a sexual harassment survey? What was going on?
Well, I think that there were a combination of things. One, the initial the survey that had been done before actually had requested as a part of that survey that another survey be done so you could do some follow-up, and that hadn't yet happened. We had quite a bit of fallout on this campus from the case involving Pierre Pierce, and particularly the way that that case was perceived to have been handled
on campus.
On campus by various university offices, and I think that there was a great deal of discussion and fallout from that case.
Were either of you involved in the previous survey, that was conducted in 1993? In what ways did that survey inform how you created the 2004 survey?
I wasn't here at that time, so what I had was the various written documents and mostly Nancy's expertise. One of the things that was learned from the previous survey was that the term itself means different things to different people.
Sexual harassment.
Sexual harassment, that's right. So we felt that it was important not to use the term and assume that everybody knew what it meant, but to define the behaviors that we were talking about and get people to tell us whether they had experienced any of these behaviors, and then, and only then, to hook it up with the term of sexual harassment.
I had already worked on a paper that was a meta-analysis looking at a lot of surveys of sexual harassment all over the country, both not only in education but in private industry. And we were looking for what explains the variance in incidence reports. It's important to know that, because otherwise when you talk about sexual harassment, people are citing figures. Somebody says 10%, somebody says 80% especially of a workplace, and unless you can get some sense of why you get that variance, it tends to really diminish the whole area, and people just take it less seriously. And so we were really interested in that, and really had determined that one thing that really mattered was how you asked the questions.
And that has an effect on the variance in the reporting.
Yes, it does, tremendously. And so I think we were able to look at the first report, and we could see what response they got, but we could see the way that the questions were asked. And I think the other thing was that the first report was a sample. And again, I think we all felt it was really critical that we survey the entire campus, that this not just be a sample size, because then people criticize your sample, and it's very difficult on a campus to get really an accurate sample.
If you do the sampling correct from a scientific point of view, it's just as valid as what we did. But it's very hard to sell that.
Yeah. The public sees it differently than the scientists do.
Correct. We've even had these arguments with the Board of Regents. So it's, it's not just some subgroup that thinks that way. It's just a scientific concept that's difficult to convey. But the other change from when the later survey was done compared to the previous one was the fact that we now had electronic media that permitted dissemination of a survey to 40,000 people. That just would not have been possible with paper from an economic standpoint, if nothing else.
So the 2004 survey was sent by email to everybody who had a University of Iowa, a uiowa.edu mail address.
That's
right?
correct.
That's right.
Well, that's 40,000 people?
It's about 44,000 altogether.
44,000 people. Yeah. And you got a pretty good response rate. Well, you didn't get 100%, but nobody ever gets 100%.
It wasn't as good as we hoped to get. I think it was, many people would say it was fine.
It was statistically significant. Is that the term, I believe? That
we hoped for more. Yeah. I think that would be fair to say. We hoped for
but
higher.
You got, about 11,000 responses?
Right. About a 25%.
And which I think for this kind of survey is really excellent. I mean, the different surveys have different rates of expectations. But.
And I think for not knowing, I think, I know that you get to this later, but one of the things that we all learned from this is that, particularly when you're surveying undergraduates, that for the next survey, which I hope will be soon, there's really a need to sit down and think about the various ways you can actually get more undergraduate participation, because that's the smallest group in the survey. So I think that's
percentage-wise.
Percentage-wise.
Yeah.
Yeah, percentage-wise compared to the numbers of freshmen or the numbers of students on
undergrads
on campus. Yeah.
Right. What was actually sent was a link, so people had to click the link. And I think that's still, I wouldn't send it as an attachment or anything. I think that's the right way to do it.
Right.
It was sent using the UI mass mail. It looks like it comes from the Office of the President. Kids say, President, delete, So I think that was one of the issues.
What were some of the surprises, some of the good or bad surprises about the response that you did get, about the results that you did get from?
Do you mean surprises in terms of who responded, or what the result?
What they said. Let's do who responded and then what they said.
The largest group was staff, if I recall correctly. And to me, that was actually not surprising. I think the staff at this university are very involved in the university as a place of employment. In some ways, more than the faculty who view their peer group as their national colleagues.
Right.
But the staff tend to identify with the university, and I think the staff probably have a more of an investment, in a sense, in their workplace.
I think we had a lot of men who responded, and we were glad to see that. I think we had a relatively small, I'd say, quite small, actually, negative response.
People
rate.
saying, I don't want to take this survey, or negative?
Yeah, I don't know, not so much that they didn't want to take it, because then they just simply didn't take it.
That's true.
But comments back to us
that it was
that
badly
were negative.
constructed, or
there were very few of those.
or
Very few of those, and I think some of that was the way the survey was constructed. I mean, we spent a lot of time writing that survey, and we tested it on a number of groups. And part of our thought was to obviously encourage people to do it and not turn off somewhere in the middle of the survey. And part of it was to try and diffuse that kind of backlash. We got a little bit, but it was very minor, and really not more than a handful. So I think that was a pleasant surprise. I would say in terms of negative surprises, maybe if I had thought about it more, I would have anticipated what would be coming from the undergrads, that the undergraduates would in fact be experiencing so many behaviors that under many circumstances would be considered sexual harassment. And even if they don't rise to that level, they're still not behaviors that you want to encourage or that you want your son or daughter to be participating in or experiencing. And so that was, I was sorry to see that. I was sorry, not entirely surprised, but the number of undergraduates who had no knowledge at all about sexual harassment, let alone the policies on campus.
What they understood it to be.
Or that the university had a policy or where they could find it. I mean, that was just disheartening. That was really disheartening. And I would add the one other thing that was not surprising, knowing the research in the area, but nonetheless, you just hope you're not going to see it, was what you get when you ask people about the behaviors and you ask if they've experienced those behaviors, and you ask that separately from the question of whether they've experienced sexual harassment. So then what we see is that we have people who are experiencing really serious behaviors that are likely to constitute sexual harassment regardless. And, not small things. People talking about being grabbed and pushed and shoved and still not classifying that behavior as sexual harassment. That makes me sad, I guess, mostly because I think probably for the person who's experiencing that, there has to be a real denial, a serious cost. So,
I think in terms of sort of, if you will, neutral surprises, the thing that surprised me most was how within group sexual harassment is. That the vast majority of sexual harassment is undergraduates, staff, faculty. I expected to see a lot more
faculty to
down.
students,
right,
or
that kind of
graduates,
thing.
faculty to graduates.
Right. But it was really peers. But as Nancy said, I would underscore this. I was shocked at the percentages of people who would say that they experienced being touched inappropriately on a daily basis, and then checking no to have you ever experienced sexual harassment.
If you're interested, you can read the whole report because all of that data is in there. But it is shocking. I mean, it's still shocking to me, and I've read it several times. And anyway, here we are. You came up with 10 recommendations that, in many ways, paralleled the recommendations from the 1993 survey. What had the university done between 1993 and 2004 to address those issues, and what things, because so many of the recommendations are the same, does the university still need to address?
I think one of the perceptions of everybody that worked on it, as we came up with the recommendations, and then would sort of look back and say, "Oh, that was recommended before."
So you wrote your recommendations independently.
Well, I'm exaggerating to make that point,
yeah.
But we actually were a ways along in it before we, because we had a little bit of trouble tracking down
the 93 survey.
The 93 one, and getting the details all put together. But I think that was something that we all particularly noted, was how many of the recommendations, had they been carried out, and had they been effectively carried out, perhaps that's more important even, we wouldn't have had to write about.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think we had a copy of the report.
We did.
Fairly early on, so we had certainly read that, and read the report. But we didn't, when we sat down to write the recommendations, sort of euphemistically on our various computers. We spent a lot of time talking to each other on our computers, mostly in the middle of the night. We did not have sitting next to us the survey, to look at what those recommendations were, but we were certainly aware of what they were. And then at I don't want to say the failure to follow through on those recommendations, because it isn't necessarily true that simply because we're repeating the recommendations that everything that was recommended wasn't acted upon. What would be true is that it wasn't acted upon at a level that those same recommendations weren't necessary anymore. I mean, given the huge numbers of students who had no clue that there was a sexual harassment policy on campus, let alone where to find it, what it was, that signals that in terms of education that's just not taking place. Given the number of people who would not go forward with complaints, particularly the written comments that we got from people in here, it doesn't mean that the university didn't talk some with DEOs and other people who might be responsible for hearing these complaints, but certainly not to a level or not in a way that actually was going to encourage people to come forward.
So clearly this is a really hard issue for not just the University of Iowa. Your research, I think, would indicate that it's difficult. And why is it so hard?
Well, I think it's hard for a number of reasons. I've spent actually a fair amount of time asking people in institutions, particularly in private institutions, in businesses, but also in colleges and universities, why is this so hard, and why isn't there more attention being paid, especially when you see really big cases, cases that have the Pierce case, cases that we had on this campus just years ago involving athletes, cases involving well-known professors. Then do you think, just from a risk analysis position, that you would look at those cases and you would see the potential for those cases to be very negative for the institution, or if you're in private sector, for a business? Why isn't there more attention being paid to this? Everybody talks about respect as a value that's held up there. We had that as a theme one year at the University of Iowa, and you think, so why are we not doing this? And the responses vary. I think they're all true. One is that at a very basic level, people are really busy. There are 1,000 things that people have to focus on. There are all kinds of problems or fires that have to be put out, or policies that have to be written. And certainly in Leanna's position in the provost's office, and for me as ombudsperson, there are a lot of things going on at any given time. And that's the same in private sector. So it's hard to get people sort of focused in here. There's a great deal of what I regard as negative publicity or mythology about sexual harassment that pervades our culture, not just our culture, really in the world.
Can you give me an example of some of that mythology, some of those things?
Sure. People that I'm very close to, that I have a great deal of respect for in many ways, have said things to me like, if all a woman, because it's seen primarily as women as the complainants, and in the overall that's true, but not exclusively. All a woman has to do on this campus is go forward with a complaint, and it's automatically found against, whoever she complains about. Now, how you can say that in light of what's actually happened that we all know about on campus, I don't know. Yeah. But that's and
well, I think it reflects a fear.
It does, a great fear.
On in this case, the example that you're giving, the men's part. Yeah. I think another reason is that the cases that make the press are tend to be over the top, so to speak. And I think people want to relegate it to that. They want to say that's an isolated incident. That's
more than
that's a
most
special
people have
case.
to-
It's not a day-to-day kind of thing. Without realizing what that is the tip of the iceberg, and there really is an iceberg that's very important and very big and very destructive beneath the surface. But by focusing on that tip, it seems like it's somebody else's problem. It's a high-profile athlete or a isolated professor, kind of thing.
Happening. And I think that people talk about these cases. When I talk with people, they usually say, well, this is all he said, she said. Well, in fact, in law, if you look at many, many, many kinds of law cases, if you go into court on any given day, it's always, almost always, one person said, the other person disagrees. Every car accident, I was stopped, no, you were moving. And so it's interesting that this particular area seems to be one that sort of draws that criticism.
And it sticks somehow.
And it sticks, but partly it sticks. People are looking for other reasons. They'll talk about alcohol was involved, or, it's that. Juries do this all the time. I mean, it's often likened to sexual assault cases. And juries often look for other kinds of reasons. There you sometimes have DNA, which you don't always have here. and I think the other thing is that there just is still, for all the strides that we've made, for all the strides and all the changes, there still is a fair amount of sexism and a fair amount of sense of, entitlement and what can happen and whether you should take this seriously or not. And, my judgment about what you should take seriously, what is that? I'm not you. Now, I'm not a student, so, how I might respond is not going to be how, for instance, a student might respond.
Also, I just think our society has a hang-up about sex. You bring that word in, and it's either, jokes that late-night comedians are making that are the adult version of potty jokes that the kids make, or it's something that people skirt around or they don't want to face as an issue.
So in the survey, the term unwelcome behavior is used to describe that. People respond, I don't know what, not more openly, but are more likely to describe what has happened to them if you say, have you experienced this kind of unwelcome behavior? So does that mean that, or does that indicate that that should be a term that we should work with more than sexual harassment? Does it somehow soften it or make it more palatable but less potent?
I think part of it is it's explicit. If you can talk about a particular behavior as, did someone touch you where you didn't want to be touched? That's a much easier question to answer than were you sexually harassed? Because
Well, it also doesn't, there's a researcher from the University of Illinois, Louise Fitzgerald, and she and her research group really have done the most consistent work over years especially about surveying people and she's really the one, they developed this notion that you ask about the behaviors and the unwelcome behaviors.
Without identifying it in a certain way.
Without necessarily classifying it. There's a stigma in calling something sexual harassment for everybody. It means different things to different people. But if I use that term, I'm going to sort of immediately tweak the ire of some people. But for people who have experienced this, they are just as likely to back right off and say, no. They don't want that stigma of being a victim, of having gone through that. It means different things. But mostly, I think you have a problem of it just means very different things to some people.
Being a victim, or, as we were talking earlier, that notion that all a woman has to do is say, of being thought of being a liar.
Yeah.
That you're just making this up because you don't like your boss.
Well, and all you have to do is, again, go back to the results and look at the people who were talking about experiencing very serious behaviors who don't classify that as sexual harassment. And you think, well, what is that?
Yeah.
Why is that? You know, do you really not think that, or do you not want that label sitting on there? It's not. I mean, if you talk to people who have gone forward, nobody will tell you it's like a cakewalk. You know, I mean, they're not all as sort of long and drawn out over decades as Jean Jew's case, for instance. But even on cases, talking to people where there's not a lot of publicity associated with it, it's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing.
I mean, consider the case, let's say, of a graduate student who experiences some kind of unwelcome behaviors from her graduate advisor. I'll use her here just as an example, again, because it is statistically the most common. To acknowledge that as, you know, sort of overtly unwelcome behavior that something has to be done about means that graduate student's going to have to face the question of who's going to be my mentor. And she may have matriculated at this institution particularly to work with a particular professor on a particular topic, and there's nobody else at the university who can work with her on that topic. So that's a career-changing decision to come forward with that.
Can I go back for a minute to something you asked, because it made me think about, because I know, are both being very careful that if we use she, that we're qualifying that. And again, I mean, some of that is because of the pushback, you know, because there will be people watching saying, you know, and it's women who work in this area. In the survey itself, you know, one of the things that we barely touch in the report, we mentioned, but we just simply couldn't do all of it. We have hundreds and hundreds of comments from people. If I was talking to somebody about doing another report, I would tell them, or another survey, think carefully about those open-ended questions.
Because you will get information.
We were really interested in, and I'm sorry that we actually, you know, both of us have been busier than being able to really go back and look at all of that information. But the kinds of things that really popped out of those comments that we weren't necessarily questioning about in here. One was, there were a lot of comments we do mention in the report about respect, about the lack of respect in the workplace, not gender-based, lack of respect based on your status in the university, lack of respect based on sexuality. Quite a bit about that, you know, that we saw come up a lot in the survey, and other kinds of comments like that really were not particularly gender-based, were people talking about other kinds of bad behavior.
Well, I think that's been parallel, too, in the work of the Ombuds Office. The focus on uncivil behavior 1 year of their report, very parallel to our findings.
To what extent did you incorporate the written comments that you got in the survey into your report? Since it's a lot easier statistically to
I think we mostly use them as examples.
Okay.
And a little bit, I think when we talked about respect, we did that. I think in a few cases there were some written comments that we got that we went directly to the units, where you could tell exactly who they were talking about, where they mentioned the units. And that was not something we wanted to do in this report. We didn't want to focus attention on any one unit. But that said, seeing this material come in, we wanted to give those units the sort of value of our knowledge, and at least, you know, talk to them about what we were reading and, you know, what they might want to address in their units.
One of the first recommendation is to ensure that the university puts some energy and effort into making sure that the university community understands that there is a policy and to know how to use the policy. So since the survey and since your report in the beginning of 2006, the university has done a few things along those lines, right? There's now a website that has sexualharassment.ui.edu that has a list of the various resources that people have that they can go to, links to the policies and so on. There is a sexual misconduct coordinator. I think that position was created around the time that the university rewrote the policy for the student sexual misconduct code. So there's an office now that students can go to and make a report to and have someone to talk to. There is online training that the faculty staff were requested to take.
Required was the word that
I realize
that. That actually became a bit of a controversy because some of the, there were some misinformation or some errors in the training itself, which was really irritating to people who knew enough to recognize that.
Yes, it was.
And part of being a professor is applying critical analysis to things. So there was a lot of pushback about how stupid this training is and how ineffective and how it's all just CYA on the part of the university.
Although the university has to do something,
absolutely,
right? And so, yes, of course, it is that, but it is done. It does that in a way of we're trying to address some issue here.
Yeah, I think that we had really hoped that training that would take place, although this is very difficult to do given the number of people who are at the university, but as someone who does training in the sexual harassment area, and I think most trainers would say this, to not have an opportunity to face-to-face talk with someone and have your questions answered. There may be some other ways. I don't know that, but I would think it would be even some kind of site or some thing that everybody tuned into and you could actually ask questions. You didn't have to be there. Something like that would be a lot more valuable. Even have people writing in and then have a follow-up that said, here are the questions that were asked, here are some responses, because it's just problematic. Now people think they can't compliment people or they have to be careful, and that's the kind of thing that just, from my point of view, feeds into the mythology and doesn't help. And then if you're someone who's experienced these behaviors and you hear people all around you say, do you hear this? Why you're never going to go forward and say that because you think that you'll be mocked, or you think it's the people that you respect think it's ridiculous. I think it's tough.
Yeah.
I think that's a hard one. And the university did have consultants come in, but those consultants came in, and I believe the position that you're talking about, the coordinator's position, was in part a response to those consultants' report, and I believe that they came in regrettably as a response to a case which occurred after our report involving a number of athletes. Not to diminish that some things, I don't want to be one of those people who's never satisfied with what's being done. Some things have been done for a host of reasons. I'd love to think they came from our report, but
one of the difficulties, I think, is that the law has different requirements that are difficult to implement simultaneously. One of the things that people will say is, you don't know where to go. You can go here or you can go there. Who's supposed to go where? It's confusing, is the comment that they will make. But the law requires that there be multiple avenues for coming forward, that it not be restricted to a certain office, because that forces people to, if you're going to that office, it might be because you're, that kind of thing. Right. So the law requires that there be multiple avenues, but as soon as you have multiple avenues, then it becomes confusing.
Right.
So
because one of the recommendations is that the people who need to enforce the policy, or at least report it, need to know that they need to do that.
Right.
And that was a problem.
Yeah. That I think is the level at which the greatest amount of education, or maybe a better way to put it would be the least amount of education would go the farthest, is at sort of that
that's right.
first
the
line
reporting level.
of, if, for example, if the RA's in the dorm, that's who the students can talk to. That's not just a straight peer. If the RA's in the dorm were really well informed, so that the students could go to the RA's and get good advice. But that scares people too, because that puts the RA's in a vulnerable position of giving legal advice. I think that's another one of the difficulties with sexual harassment is it's not just
No, it isn't.
the university's internal policy. Let's say the policy of, what's the one with the students? You can't have some kind of
The consensual relations.
consensual relations. That's the term I was looking for. Yeah, that's a UI policy.
Right.
But sexual harassment is a law, and so as soon as you get into legal entanglements, again, people get kind of skittish.
Yeah, but the problem is that I think people get overly skittish.
Well,
I think they get so concerned, not in all areas, but in some areas, and then that becomes the reason why they don't do things. I think a place where you see that, and both some legal issues as well as some real serious value questions. One of our recommendations, and I know something they're struggling with now in redoing the policy, has to do with letting people know what happens. If you don't tell people what the consequences are, they will think that nothing is done.
You're talking about letting the complainant know what happened,
Yeah,
or the
I think
university community, or
I think both. I think that we actually felt that the complainant needed to know specifically what happened. The complainant knows who they were complaining about and what happened. But we also thought it would be good for the university community to at least generally know what came up, not just somebody was disciplined, because what does that mean? That could mean what? They had a furlough day, or they were told don't do this again, or a letter was put in their file. It could mean that they were suspended or more seriously sanctioned, but we don't have any way of knowing that. And most people are cynical and assume the least was done. So we know that that's really important. We know in the legal system, I mean, look at how the criminal justice system works. It would work probably very differently if we had no idea whatever happened to people who were charged. But that said, there are privacy interests here. There are interests, a lot of interests with the person who is complained about. They have interests as well. These aren't formal evidentiary hearings most of the time. They may be formal hearings, but they don't necessarily involve lawyers. It's not like a courtroom case, certainly.
They can.
They might.
They can.
They can rise to that level.
Yeah, that's right. If the faculty dispute procedures are followed through all the way, there definitely are lawyers involved.
And then again, so if you've gone through that, then you really wonder why you're not making it public, because you've been through a very rigorous kind of hearing process.
And in fact, unless both sides agree, and I can't remember a case when I was in the provost's office when both sides agreed to keep it private, these hearings are open. Anybody can come to them.
But the results are not publicized, and so
they're open but not publicized. Sometimes, I mean, there was one case when Mary Sue Coleman was president, and she decided that the easiest thing to do was send her report to the press.
Yeah,
that was not a sexual harassment case. It was another kind of case, but a sexual harassment case involving a faculty member would have been no different, and yet that hasn't been done. I really admired her for just saying, rather than my trying to tell you about this, here's my report.
And doing that. So, but I guess my point was that I understand that there are a lot of different values that are at stake, and a lot of reasons why, especially when you're in a close community, why people may not want to go forward. But there are a lot of repercussions for not doing that all the way around, not just for the person who complained, but for all of that person's, everybody they know who may know something about it, but also what it signals to future, to people coming forward. Like, why?
Right.
That was some of the questions in the later part of the survey were addressed only to those people who felt that they had been sexually harassed, and asking them what they did about it. And the number of people who said, nothing, and then we asked why, because I didn't think anything would be done. There was a real sense of helplessness in the respondents.
There's no point in putting myself in this really awkward, unpleasant situation because nothing is going to happen.
Right.
Except perhaps I'm going to
Except repercussions on me.
Publicly.
That's right.
And then it's exacerbated when you have a case that's not well handled, that gets a really lot of press, that feeds right into, look at what happens. these people were taken apart publicly, the people who came forward to complain about sexual harassment, sexual assault. So we're not at a level of, oh, maybe this is bad, maybe not. Now we're very serious behavior. And what do you see? You see that, well, you can be taken apart sort of publicly. People are going to make statements about you. They're going to call you a liar in public. Not a lot of people are going to come forward and do that.
Yeah. One of the recommendations, one of the 10 recommendations, it was good you kept it to 10. Was that hard?
Not too bad.
Was that the survey be repeated in 5 years. I assume that so that you don't wait for another 10 years or whatever to do so you have some data that has at least some consistency in the terms of the group reporting.
I think it was also in part because if you say we're going to do this again in 5 years, there's some sense of urgency about implementing other recommendations so that the responses 5 years later will be different.
So I guess we're waiting for the Council on the Status of Women to come to the university and say, it's now 2010 and it's time to do the survey. Another one of those recommendations is that we work to get more undergraduate response. Since you've been away from it for a while now, can you imagine how that would be accomplished?
I would get the undergraduate leadership and even beyond that, try to get, I don't know how else to characterize it, but undergraduates from various parts of the university involved. I don't think adults can figure out how best to get through to kids.
Yeah.
They have to come forward and tell us themselves. Maybe the best way to do it is text them.
We talked a lot about that at the end. We talked a great deal about how we could have gotten a better response rate from the undergraduates. One of the things was the residence halls, but the residence halls is just going to capture mostly first and second year students. Right. There are issues about doing it with through your classes because you don't want people repeating, although you actually couldn't repeat this because once you had logged in. But classes could get involved in some way.
You could just go to a different computer.
Oh.
Yeah, you could take it multiple times if you wanted. You have
I
no
thought
way
we had SurveyMonkey set up so that you couldn't use your login ID and... Tells you what I remember about that.
That was a problem. We ultimately decided there were very
risk.
few people who were going to be motivated enough to get on and do it multiple times.
There might be, if there was a way to do that, you might be able to get through.
There is a way,
classes.
but we didn't feel with 44,000 people we could, because
the data
it's usually
be skewed very much by 2 or 3 students.
So I think it's hard. I think it's tough. We talked about whether you could tie it to something. Whether you could have to take the survey before you could register. There are ways
like alcohol
you could do
EDU, right?
Yeah,
That
there are things that you
required
could do.
So those are things that you'd be willing to pass on to the next survey group?
Absolutely.
Yes, we would. It should be able to go, I would hope that it wouldn't take as long. It took us a long time to generate this survey.
And you think the instrument is pretty good, would not need much
Yeah, I actually do.
work. So that part of it would not be so difficult.
And you'd like to see it not change too much so that you actually could compare the numbers. Yeah, I think by and large, there was a lot of time that went into it and a huge amount of front-end research about reading. Our bibliography was just gigantic for this. We had 2 phenomenal librarians on this committee, so we had a big bibliography.
Yeah.
We did a big...
So the survey changed a great deal from 1993 to 2004, partly because there were data to indicate that you need to do things in a different way.
Right.
The data has not changed. The research has not changed since then, so that would indicate that the way you've constructed things, the way you've constructed the survey is considered how things
I don't think
are
much
best
would
done
need
now.
to be changed. I think they could. There's a few things, and we had some minor problems with the distribution. It got sent to some groups who probably shouldn't, because we were interested in employees, but it went to people who, like alums and retirees.
Went
and
to
things
UI Foundation.
And the UI Foundation groups that, but we ultimately calculated it was a pretty minor percentage and decided not to worry about it. But there's a few things like that that would need to be cleaned up.
Yeah.
But
In the time since the survey results have come out, what kinds of things have you seen change on this campus, for better or for worse, or neither one or the other? But have you seen results? Have you seen things that you can attribute to the fact that you spent a lot of time and energy writing this survey, conducting it, and then writing a big report too?
whether this is meaningful or not, I don't know. But I have noticed a number of posters, for example, up around campus that convey the message that sexual harassment can occur anywhere. That I think they're actually pretty well done, and I think the message in them is to let go of some of your preconceptions about when and where and how and between whom and so forth, because there's a whole variety of them where sexual harassment can take place. Whether that has any effect or not, it's hard to say.
But it's a
But
message.
it was something. It's a message.
I think
Right.
the creation of the position that you talked about,
Sexual
the
response
coordinator,
misconduct coordinator,
you know,
yeah.
well, obviously that's going to take time to see how that's working. I don't know who knows about that, how it's being publicized. I don't know those
We need to
things.
ask the students. We're kind of back to that again.
We
because
do,
we need to
but I don't
ask the
know.
undergrad.
Yeah, but it isn't just the students. I mean, there's faculty and staff, and I don't know if they're all mostly going to the ombuds office or they're going somewhere else. So I don't know how much of that, is regularly coming around. I think it was good to have consultants in. You know, I don't know if their report was useful to us or not. I mean, I think that remains to be seen. There's a lot of effort right now going into rewriting the sexual harassment policy. I think the effort is good. I think that could be good. Obviously, you know, in the end, though, it doesn't matter what your policy is. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's good to have good policies. If you're watching this, it's important to have a good policy. It matters. Some policies are horrible, but if you don't enforce the policy, if you don't send a very strong message that you take this behavior seriously, that you seriously want a campus on which people treat each other with respect. I mean, that is the umbrella term here. If that's not the serious, ongoing message, if you don't have people publicly, people like famous people like coaches or administrators suggesting that people who come forward with these complaints aren't telling the truth or there's more to these stories, every time that happens, it doesn't matter what your policy is or who you have in place, because the bigger, louder message is you will pay for this, you know, if you go forward. And that's we just have to take that really seriously and really think about how we're responding on these cases. And it isn't just how we respond to the big public cases, but those big public cases are the ones that people are going to see and draw their conclusions from. So, you know.
So, respect, and one of the recommendations was to talk about respect, to address that issue of respect or lack thereof, and so
consistently, not for a year, not for 1 month of CANBUS posters, but consistently in everything. Corporations have value statements, you know, and the best of them just talk about that all the time with all their employees, and it's everywhere, and everything they do. I went into ITS this morning, and I see they have big statements up, you know, about here is our philosophy, here are our goals, and everything we do, every policy, everything we do, these are what we're using. Assuming that that's true, that's what I'm talking about.
That said, though, there's the phenomenon of if it's there all the time, you can't see it. So the other thing that I think goes along with this is, while it has to be there, it also has to keep changing and being done in different ways.
so that you see, it's
Right.
still, the message is still respect, but let me look at it in this way.
That's right. That's right. That's the way that we're built biologically in perception. Is we respond to change, Our senses respond to change. So if something is just there all the time,
right.
it becomes background instead of figure. So
different ways of conveying the message.
Exactly.
You mean. That's,
Yeah.
yes, so I
Exactly.
totally agree
Yeah.
with that. I didn't mean just have a sign on the wall.
Right,
It's just
right.
that just that they actually put those values right out there and say that, and then look for different ways.
And I think it's actually very key to be looking at different ways, because otherwise you get the, oh yeah, we've heard this before, ho-hum, you know, and it does become very ho-hum. The other thing that I think is more difficult in a university than in a corporate setting, although it's not trivial in a corporate setting, is the rate of turnover. Students, a new batch of 4,000 students, or however many it is, comes in every year. Faculty turnover at the rate of several, staff turnover at, you know, huge rates. And so there has to be something ongoing.
So that new people see it as well as people who've seen it before, but they see it in a
new way.
different way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I hope that that people are out there listening and watching and sort of wondering, well, maybe I should go look at this survey and see what the results are. There's a link to it on the Council for the Status of Women website. There's also a link from the President's website, so you can go and look at. There's an executive summary if you don't want to read all 160-some pages. And
there's lots of tables for
and
people
lots
who
of
like
tables.
data tables.
And I really appreciate your coming in and talking about this and kind of reminding us of work that was done and that is still waiting to be responded to.
Pleasure, thank you. We'll look forward to taking the next survey.
Thank you very much for another session of Women at Iowa.